Okay, welcome back. And on this lecture, I'm going to just recap or discuss one point that I wasn't able to cover at the end of Unit 3. At the end of Unit 3, we were talking about representation, and I wanted to talk just a little bit more about the kind of odd exception of Roman art and how Romans at various times had slightly different points of view about portraiture compared to most of the ancient world. I want to talk about that, and we just kind of ran out of time. So I'm going to talk about that, but I'm also using that as a chance to do kind of a quick survey of Roman art, because normally I skip Roman art, and I thought this would be kind of nice for us to see. And that will set up then the next lecture, which is on the transition from the late Roman, early Christian period all the way to the Gothic period, and which is also a really stretches way too large a time to be covered in a single lecture, but we're going to do it anyway. Anyway, so the first point I wanted to make was that we were talking about portraiture and how ambivalent and even suspicious and negative most cultures who have produced art are towards portraiture. And one exception to that are the Romans, and for kind of some unusual reasons. The Romans turned out, especially at the beginning, at the kind of like late Republic, early imperial period, the early kind of Augustan period, were much more comfortable with portraiture in sculpture. And one of the reasons for that is because the Romans practiced kind of a family-based cult of ancestors, where every major family would keep kind of like a family crypt in their villa, a place where the dead were buried, kind of like a basement in their house. And in there, they would also keep masks. They would make death masks out of wax of the dead ancestors, and then from those wax death masks, they would then also create plaster masks. And then also sometimes families would have stone, like marble busts made of portraits of these ancestors. And because you're making them based off of wax impressions of a face, which pick up every little tiny detail, therefore that kind of got translated into the sculpture as well. So we see some examples of that here, with this patrician bust, and with this beautiful piece of patrician holding the busts of his ancestors. And this actually connects to a rather odd tradition where on certain holidays, the Romans were expected to go down to the family crypt, like all the family members, and were expected to put on the masks of various ancestors and then be those ancestors for that day, which is interesting and strange. But one of the things also that is interesting is if we contrast that to this picture of Commodus here, a Roman emperor, is that when the Romans wanted to make public sculpture for the purposes of state and religion, they erred on the side of the Greeks, which was this probably is very little, based off of the actual look of Commodus, and much more just based off of the conventions of Heracles. And so this was kind of a common thing that, like, within the kind of family connection, there was a little bit of embrace of a very kind of exacting and almost a kind of a warts and all approach to portraiture. But then in lots of other contexts, there was a similar kind of similar ambivalence towards portraiture. So I wanted to show just some more Roman sculpture. We will be talking about the colossal head of Constantine when we get to a discussion about scale, and we'll look at this piece at least one more time. But here, that's kind of a nice contrast to see, from the beginning of the empire to closer to the end, depending on how you date it, based on whether you go all the way to the end of the Byzantine Empire or. But there's very different approaches, but I think it's really interesting to see the colossal head in context here, so you can get a sense of its scale. Like, it's basically almost the size of a standing person. And so if you imagine how that whole sculpture would have looked with the head and all the parts attached, it would have been quite ginormous. And the equestrian sculpture of Marcus Aurelius, which is covered in the textbook, by the way. I think there's actually an extra question on that particular piece at some point. And um, so one of the things I want to say about Roman art, just as a general, is a lot of Roman art was very, very indebted to Greek, Hellenic, and Hellenistic, classical Greek and Hellenistic Greek art. And there were kind of like, in a way, two trends going on in Roman art. One was just a general trend of like continuation of the trends of Hellenistic art. So we do see some even more kind of a continuation of some interest in realism in some places, a continuation of some interest in kind of extreme, um, expression. But there was also in Roman art a love of the more placid idealism of classical Greece and kind of a sense of like turning that into museum pieces. Um, and I don't know if I wanted to say anything else. So, and we see that also in the use of sculpture on more architectural forms. Right, and here we have Trajan's Column and the Triumphal Arch of Constantine. And we see it in their use of architecture as well. There's Roman architecture is not Greek architecture, and in some ways is quite different. But the kind of the sense of continuity with Greek architecture, the sense of indebtedness to Greek, to classical architecture, and the sense of kind of like using Roman architecture as a way of spreading the influence of Greek culture was definitely a part of it. Here we have more views of the Pantheon, an interior as well as the exterior, and even a floor plan. Crazy me. And lastly, I want to talk about painting in the Roman Empire. And this leads to two topics. One is just that I think we tend to see both like here in the Roman period, but also in the Renaissance, we tend to see more creativity in painting, in part because painting doesn't last as well and gets lost more easily. So there was less for people to be loyally indebted to when it comes to classical Greek painting. And so in painting, there could be a little bit more of an adventurous spirit. And then the other point I wanted to make about painting that specifically relates to this page is don't forget that Rome was both an Italian, a Latin, or a Roman in the center of the empire, but Rome was also an empire that included lots and lots of cultures. So there's Egyptian Roman, right? And there was, Anatolian Roman, and there was Roman on the north coast of Africa, like what is today Morocco. All of these places were to a degree Roman, and each of them had their own expressions of Roman culture. Um, and but the and some of the best painting we found from the Roman period is from Pompeii, where they happen to have been preserved so beautifully, unfortunately by the volcanic explosion. But it's a great source for us. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say about Roman art, and I covered that last point that I wanted to cover when we were talking about representation. And so next lecture, I will start with the transition from early Christian art or late Empire all the way to the Gothic.